So welcome officially to Qdabra Software's weekly webinar. My name is Ernesto Machado. I have been with Qdabra for 5 years, and today's webinar we're going to talk about save and submit best practices as related to SharePoint. So InfoPath use in SharePoint. If you've attended a previous webinar, you know that this webinar requires computer audio. If you have computer audio, you're hearing my voice right now. We typically start this presentation and demo at 5 after the hour. And then afterwards, we'll have a summary. We always have a special offer at the end, and we try to get to questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So save and submit are two different operations that your users can perform in an InfoPath form. And they are not the same operation. Save, and when I talk about save, I'll also be including the SaveAs option. Save and submit are not the same thing. This data connection wizard screenshot that I have up on the screen right now shows a submit data connection. So this data connection submits data to a form library in SharePoint. And you see it has a file name, and the checkbox to allow overwrite file is checked. And I want to jump right into the first form here. So I already have this form set up on my SharePoint site. And it's a fairly simple form where I can type in a name, I can type in an email, and I can type in a phone. And I have a couple of options here. How do I want to store this data? So the first thing to notice is we have a submit button. This submit button uses a submit action. And the file name, when I submit the form, the file name is going to be this name right here. So that immediately brings up a possible issue, and it's that name may not be unique. So if you have a non-unique name, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have the possibility of overwriting data. So if there are two records with the same name, you're going to get overwrite, and that's not a good scenario. You're going to lose data. This submit button is the same submit operation as is shown in the SharePoint ribbon right here, top left. And let me show you that in design mode just so you understand what's going on. So this is the submit button that I'm talking about, and I should hide this. Yeah. So this is the submit button I'm talking about, and if we go to the button properties, you're going to see that it's an action type of submit. And it has some submit options that I can configure to submit to a SharePoint library. So that's the first option, okay? We're going to submit through this submit action, right, which can be done in the ribbon, or it can be done in the this button. So let me just submit through the ribbon, and you'll see that show up in my form library. There it is. So let me go back into that form and show you the other options. We can also submit using rules. This is no different than the submit button, except that we get more options. We get the option to execute other actions before submit happens. Let me show you that in design mode so you understand what's going on. If we go to the Manage Rules task pane, we're going to see that I can actually set the file name. So this action happens first. I set the file name, and I'm setting the file name to the current timestamp now. That's the timestamp down to the millisecond. And then I submit. Whereas in the submit action, I can only submit, and that's it. I just have the submit action. Here I can do all sorts of actions. And then have my last action be the submit. So it's really provides a lot of options. Now the thing to keep in mind here is that the submit button in the ribbon is is going to perform this submit action. If you're submitting using rules, that's not possible through this button in the ribbon. It's going to be possible only through the button on the canvas. So I'll click that, and you'll see immediately when the screen reloads that the file name for this form is different. It's not the name of the person, it's the actual timestamp when this was submitted down to the millisecond, 8 a.m., 10 minutes, 33. So down to the second, sorry. There are more options. So that covers the 2 submit options in this very simple form, this very first sample. We also have file save as and file save. These are going to allow the user to save the file to the current library. So let's say that I don't have much information. That's all I have. Obviously, in this scenario, submitting is not going to work because I don't have a name, right? This first submit button is using the name. Submit using rules is going to work because the name is actually the timestamp, where we're setting that dynamically. But we have left save and save as available in the ribbon to the users, so the users can just come here and click save as and provide a file name and save. And if we return to the SharePoint form library, we're going to see that file here, that form here called temporary. And why is this problematic? Well, you can imagine that a user can provide any sort of name for this file. And so this first form, I have on purpose created 3 documents, 3 forms that have very different names, right? So there's a big inconsistency here, right? One was submitted using rules and it uses the timestamp, and the timestamp is pretty unique. You know, let's say that only one form gets submitted each second, so the name is unique. This is not unique because you could have 2 records with that same name. It's certainly a possibility. And then temporary, that's a can of worms because I could come back here and do save as and save this other one, try to save this other one as, let's say, temporary 2, and you can end up with a big mess in the form library of forms that have been stored with whatever name the user opted to use. Let me just refresh that so you see that. So it can get messy pretty quickly, right? So this form was designed on purpose just to show you that scenario. I briefly mentioned overwrite, and you'll notice that the overwrite checkbox is checked in this data connection screen. Overwriting is important for you to keep in mind as you're developing the form, because the form ideally is going to generate the file name only once. So let's say that when the form is first created, that file name gets generated, and that file name is not ever again generated. So you're going to continue overwriting the same form with that same file name. If your rules in some way allow the file names to get recalculated, regenerated, modified, you're going to end up with a new form submitted. You're going to end up with 2 records instead of 1. So depending on your scenario, maybe you want a second record, but in general, once the form is generated, set the file name, and that file name stays consistent going forward so that any changes that get made just get overwritten. Okay. In that first demo form that we saw, our second submit action that used rules, we used the timestamp as the file name for the form. And we can ask ourselves whether it's unique, right? And it really depends on your scenario. How many users do you have? How many forms they're going to be submitting? We assume that there's only 1 form created every second. Is that unique enough? Depends on your scenario. Certainly a form that has high use, lots of users, you could run into some issues there. So how could we create a more unique file name? And I'm going to break here from the demo and just say, you can generate the file name in many different ways. Hopefully my screen is still showing. There it goes. Sorry. Okay, hopefully it's showing again now. The key here is that when we submitted using rules, we were setting the file name, right? And maybe the now timestamp isn't unique enough. Maybe you want to make that more unique by concatenating it with something else. So let's say we concatenate it with the name, right? And maybe that makes it unique enough. So what I'm saying is, when you're submitting using rules, you can generate the file name, and you can create a rule to generate that file name however you want. The key is that you are addressing, you're obtaining a unique file name, and if you can address that through your own custom file name, then that's great. This next form that we're going to show the second form that we're going to show is going to make use of this. What we're going to do is we're going to still use submit to a data connection. You can see this here. You can see that the submit action, the submit button, doesn't have a rule to determine the file name. And the reason for that is I'm going to determine the file name when the form is created. And if you're using, you could do that on form load. If you can detect that the form is new, you can generate the file name at that point. But I'm using QRules to do this. QRules has a node called finished loading, which becomes true when the form has finished loading in the browser. It's sort of a form load, similar to form load here in the ribbon. So what I'm going to do as soon as the form finishes loading is I'm going to execute a command called generate GUID. So it's going to generate a unique identifier for my form, and I'm going to use that result to set my file name. So let me show you that in action. Maybe that's a little bit clearer. So this is going to be completely independent of the timestamp. It's completely independent of what I enter in the name field. When I submit, it's going to generate a unique identifier, right? And the great quality about the unique identifier is that it's unique, right? We could come here and we can have 10 users submitting the form at the same time, and they're going to get a unique identifier each time, right? There's no risk of duplication here. Of course, the unique identifier is a little bit ugly to look at, so that's one disadvantage. But as I mentioned, the key is that you achieve a unique file name, and we achieve that in many different ways. The unique identifier in QRules is just one of those possibilities. So that's the demo that we just saw. Use QRules to create unique identifiers, and we have some more information on our website concerning how to generate unique identifiers, and we go through different options and their disadvantages, their advantages. So this link will really help. If you have registered for the webinar, if you send me an email after the webinar, then I'll make sure that you get the slides and the forms that I have been demoing. So we have addressed submit. How do we address save? Well, it's a little bit more complex, because as we saw here, a user can just save a form under whatever name they want, and that's a little problematic. What we propose is that you create a status column, and you can set this status to saved to allow a user to temporarily store a form without this notion of submit, right? Without this notion of labeling a form completed, right? Submitted. This is gonna give the user an alternative, so they're not using file SaveAs, so they're not going into the pitfalls involved in that. So let me show you that in action first, and then I'll show you what I've done in the form. And again, the key here is we're providing two buttons, save, submit, and I've also added a close button here for good measure. But I'm not providing the ribbon. You'll notice that the ribbon is gone. I have turned those off in the form options. And the reason I have done that is I don't want my users to submit using the ribbon, and I don't want my users to submit using, to save using file, save, or save as. I want them to save, quote unquote, using this button. So let me just show you that. So let's just say that all I know is the name, and I have to come back later to enter phone and email. And you'll see that the status was automatically calculated as new because the form is new. It hasn't been saved. It hasn't been submitted. So when I click save, the status is going to change to saved. And if I close the form and return to the form library, you see that there's a status column called save. I have opted to use a timestamp for my name. And again, we've talked about the options already for that, so you can choose something else if you desire. When the user comes back to the form, they're going to see that the status is saved. They're going to have the option to save again, right? So let's say they come back and they know the phone number this time. See, so they can save. And the phone number has been stored. And let's say that they come back later and they have the email. And once they type in all the information, right, name, phone, email, that's when the submit button has become enabled. So they can only submit this form once all the data has been filled out, right? And now they can click submit, and the status is going to change to submitted. And if we close and return to the form library, you see the status changed to submitted. You see that our columns have the name, the phone, and the email. And if we come back into the form, you're going to see that save has disappeared from our canvas. We can no longer save the form because it's already changed from the status saved to submitted. So there's I haven't enabled an option here to go back to a previous status. It's been submitted, then I imagine there's a different process that goes on with the form now that it's been submitted. If I need to make a change, that's fine. I can come here, make a change, and I can resubmit, right? But the status doesn't change. So let me show you that in design mode because it's really key to understand what's going on here. In the, you can see the first thing to note is that the status is read-only. The users have no way of modifying this. It's just an expression box, a calculated value, so they're not going to be typing in. They're not going to be changing this manually. The only way that the status will change is through their actions when clicking the save and the submit button. When they click the save button, I'm going to set the status to saved. I'm going to clear errors. And this is really key. Why am I clearing errors? Well, you'll notice that the name field is required and has a red asterisk next to it. And if I open a new form, you're going to notice that the field is required, right? So what happens if I know the phone number and I don't know the email? Well, that's fine. I fill out the phone number and I click save. The form gets saved, right? So you might be asking yourselves, how did the form get saved, submitted to a SharePoint form library when this required field is blank? That's why we're calling the qrules command clear errors. Clear errors is going to allow us to store that form even with the blank required field name. But you notice that when the user reopens the form, that field is still labeled as cannot be blank. So when they come back to the form, they are reminded that they need to fill out this field. After we clear the errors, we set the file name. We only set the file name if the file name is blank. So this only happens once. It only happens on first submit. And then we submit to the SharePoint form library. So you'll notice that there's no actual file save. If we go to the form options, I have disabled the entire ribbon. I have disabled all of the options, save, save as, etc. So the users have no way of saving this into the SharePoint form library under whatever name they want. They have to click save. They have to click submit. And the other thing I want to show you here in the save button is I have disabled, I have hidden the save button if the status has moved on to submitted. The submit button works in a similar way to the save button. We set the status to submit it. We set the file name in case the file name is blank, because it is possible that a user comes into the form and just clicks submit. They have all the information, so they just click submit. And then we submit to the SharePoint form library. This data connection to submit to the SharePoint form library is the same data connection that we use in the save button. It's the same data connection. The only thing that's changing is the status. The other thing we're doing with the submit button is that we're disabling it if there's any blank data. So there's no way that this form can move into submitted status if there's any blank data in the form. And then the close button is just closes the form. So there's nothing fancy there. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, if you send email feedback to coursemanager@qdabra.com, we can send you these slides. We can send you the sample forms. Since I have used qrules for one of these sample forms, I'll also include a free trial version of qrules in that package for you to try out the clear errors command that I used. And if you have any feedback in general, any questions, just feel free to send email to this email address on your screen. And okay, so I'll leave this screen up while I look at the questions. Okay, so there's nothing in chat. Let's check questions. Sounds good here. All good. It's not showing. Okay. That wraps up my presentation. If there are any questions, feel free to... Oh yeah. I'll wait for a second here to allow you guys to type. So there's a question from Mohit Gupta. Does qrules need to be installed on the server? No, qrules is a part of your form. It's not a server piece. So you could have forms on your server that don't use qrules, and you could have forms that use qrules. Qrules is only needed at the form level, only in the forms that actually need it. It's injected on a per form basis. Hopefully that answers that question. Can you show us the submit data connection for the last form? Sure thing. So this is the third demo form that I showed, and this is the data connection right here. So there's no status involved here. It's just the file name that was automatically calculated using the now timestamp. And so you might ask yourself, I'm not using now here. That's key, right? If you use the now timestamp for your file name, it's going to get regenerated each time. So that's why I'm only using, I'm only setting that timestamp in the action here. right? And I have this condition that says we're only going to do this if the file name is blank. So it's only going to happen once. Let me leave that data connection up in case you need to take a look here. So that was Tiffany's question. Keith's asking, can you save a form without closing it? Yes. That's what we're doing right here. So I'm just going to open this form, and I'm just going to save it. I'm not even going to type anything. And after the save operation is done, it's not going to close. It's going to remain open. It's only going to close when I click the close button. And you can see that it's been saved. It's all blank. All the columns, phone, name, email, are blank. If I return to that form, I can type in a name. And I can save again. It's not going to close the form. And so on. So in this form, in this sample form, I have separated the save operation and the close operation. So close is an actual button click. Okay, so hopefully that clears that up. Thanks for all the questions, guys. Follow-up. We have a multi-view, multi-page form. Need a save and continue without closing button. Yeah, that's in this scenario, right? And I'm talking about a SharePoint form library. We could submit, right? And let me just add another view. And this is just a test view. I'm not going to have anything in it. But let's just say that once I click save, then I have my next action. You could put in a condition there, such as, some field has been filled out, some required field. So then I can switch views here. So if I just save and republish that. Let's give it a second to republish, and I'll try that out. Okay, that's taking, it's still going. Okay, here goes. So I'll just fill in some data here and just save. And if I did that correctly, then it should switch me to my other view. So yeah, that's definitely possible. Let's see. Okay, so that question is answered. Okay. Can you submit to a form? Can you submit a form to multiple libraries simultaneously? Yes, as long as you're doing it through rules, not through a submit action. So I could have, if I return here to my submit action, this one's submitting to this data connection. I would just add another data connection, right? I'm sorry. Here we go. I would just submit to another form library. And yeah, that's definitely possible. The key in that scenario is that the form has to be published to both the form libraries so that the users can reopen the forms whenever they need to. And you just want to make sure that those are kept in sync. Okay, I have a form with the submit button and names the file name variable onload. The name is the username and date time. Users do not need the name when looking for their file. Fortunately, the name field in SharePoint seems to be the only one with a full drop-down menu. Are there other options where I wouldn't need the name column? That's a good point. I believe that we have some view options here. Let me check the available columns. So we have the name, which is linked to document with edit menu. And we have a name which is linked to document. It's not going to have the drop-down menu. See, so there is a second name column that's going to open that form, but it doesn't have the drop-down menu. I guess the other option would be we have the type column. That should work. Now there's an icon column here that we can, I think it's that one. Yeah, so edit. No, that's not it. Yeah, so the other thing I've done in the past, and this isn't by any means a beginner task, but the other thing I've done in the past is that I edit the form library using SharePoint Designer, and I just add a URL to one of the other columns manually. That's not too difficult to do, but you have to be careful so you don't irreparably damage your form library. But yeah, it's possible. So I would suggest, if you're interested in that, create a test form library and install SharePoint Designer and try to add a link using SharePoint Designer to one of the other columns. I've done that in the past and it should be possible to achieve. And that way you can hide the name column, which the users won't need to see. Okay, let me get to the last questions here. Does Qrules support SharePoint 2007? Yes, it does. Wait. I suddenly lost the question. Here it is. Does Qrules support SharePoint 2007? Yes, it does, Keith. SharePoint 2007, SharePoint 2010, and Office 365. Next question is, what are the best practices for having one and more submit button? Example, submit for user filling out a request form and submit for a person fulfilling the request, updating status of request. I think the best practice is that you, number one, it's the file name. That's really the key. You want to make sure that your file name is unique. You want to make sure that you're overwriting when you need to overwrite, so you don't create duplicates. Number two is status. Keep track of the status through a status column that users can't modify. The status value would be modified through button clicks. So if they click save, it gets set to saved. If they click submit, it gets set to submit. And then the other thing you can do is conditional formatting, right? And I had a little bit of this here in the form where I was hiding the save button if the status was set to submit it. The other way to think about this is the other way to think about this is you could have rules that submit to a different form library if the status changes, right? So you could have a sort of a form library for saved forms and a form library for submitted forms. And that gets a little bit more complex in this scenario, but as long as you have your conditions set here in the rules, then that should work. In that scenario, then that would allow you to have a form library for people filling out request forms and people fulfilling the request, right? Because the request would be, the request wouldn't move to the fulfillment library until it has been submitted and so on. So there's that option. If you want to manage it within one SharePoint library, then status is really the key. And you can use status to show and hide fields on the canvas, show and hide buttons on the canvas. So keeping track of the status is really the key there, to make sure that you're showing the users what they need to see and when they need to see it. Is now function available in SharePoint 2007? It's an InfoPath function, and I do believe that it was available in InfoPath 2007. Does this save submit work in SharePoint 2007 as well? Yes, it does work in SharePoint 2007. And actually, the demo that I performed was on Office 365. So yes, it works in SharePoint 2010, and it works in SharePoint 2007. It's just a regular SharePoint form library submit, and we're just using the status value to our advantage, right? That's really our leverage here. How we keep track of status and how we conditionally show and hide things on the canvas according to this status. How can we lock a form when another user has it open? The functionality that SharePoint offers for this is check-in, check-out. I have not shown those columns here, but let me check a different form library. And that's kind of getting into a different topic, but it's something that just do a Google search on it and some articles might come up. If the document is checked out, then that's what you're looking for. You're looking to check out the document to a certain user, allow that user to make changes, and then that user would check it in. That's really what SharePoint offers for this unlocking purpose. That's kind of veering off topic, so let me get to the next question. Can we concatenate ID column to the file name? Yeah, the file name can be anything you want. You're controlling the file name through rules on your form. So it's really up to you what you do. The problem with the ID field, and I think you're talking about the ID field that SharePoint automatically generates. The problem is that ID field, SharePoint generates it on the submit action. So it's not going to be available to you in the form. It's only going to be available once you reopen the form. So you can't use that initially to generate the file name. So that's why we're using something else for the name. This ID, you see, it doesn't have a link to open the form. It's automatically generated by SharePoint. SharePoint doesn't even put it on default view. It's just an internal counter for SharePoint. So I wouldn't recommend worrying about the ID when you're trying to generate the file name. Try to generate a file name that's unique to your form. The other thing to keep in mind here is that if you have to migrate these documents, right? Let's say you have to migrate half of the documents to another location, that ID is going to change. That's going to cause a problem, but your name's not going to change. Your name's unique to your form, to your form's content. So it's really better to just avoid the SharePoint ID. I have a form library for engineering requests. It contains new, active, and completed requests. When a request goes to the complete status, can the submit button redirect the form to a different form library? Completed request. This would leave me with a big field. Is what can I do with the original file? In that scenario, it almost seems like you want to create views, perhaps. maybe have a status column, right? New, completed, active, etc. Maybe you create views. SharePoint allows creating, you can come here and create a view, and you can filter that view on status. So if somebody needs to access only the completed view, then you give them a completed a view that shows only status completed. I think that what you're trying to do can probably be accomplished through some more SharePoint designer work, but I think it's a little bit beyond the scope of this webinar. Yeah, if you keep the history of the same library as active, then you get a massive number of files. You could have an archiving process where after an item has been in status completed for a certain period of time, it could get archived to a separate form library. Maybe it's no longer going to be needed to access. Maybe after the quarter's over, those get moved off to an archive form library or something like that. Yeah, that's certainly something to think about depending on the number of files that are going to be generated. For some of these questions that have come up, you can send email to Course Manager. Where's that page? Yeah, send email to Course Manager and suggest webinar topics. We always take a look at those emails. Any insight on how we can generate unique number in an InfoPath form? Let me refer you to this blog post. Send me email after the webinar, Mohit, and I'll send you the blog posts that we have on that. I'll get you some ideas to get started on generating a unique number. Okay, we're at 45 past the hour, so I think I have to end the webinar, or it's gonna end itself pretty soon. So let me just ask any other questions be sent to the address on the screen, coursemanager@qdabra.com, and we'll try to get to those, and I'll send out the forms, the slides to anyone who sends email, anyone who sends feedback or additional suggestions for webinar topics in the future. Thank you for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you on our next weekly webinar.